Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Discover Dorico for January 2022. Um, Today's session is going to be about the smart MIDI import options in Dorico 4. It's part of the workflow improvements that we've done in Dorico 4, and there have been some. There's a video already by Anthony about this. I thought we could look in a bit more detail about some of these options and that kind of thing and answer some questions. There's also, I guess we did look at this a little bit in the launch video, which was 2 weeks ago. Feels like a long time. So Dorico 4 when it came out 2 weeks ago. And in that one, we looked at a Bruce Hornsby MIDI file from the internet. This time, I want to look at a larger, Cubase imported. Other DAWs are available, but a larger project, a media example, and that kind of thing, and a look at a real world workflow. This session will be mainly, well, I've probably only used Dorico Pro for this one, but actually all the things we're looking at here are also available in Dorico Elements. So all of the new MIDI import things we're about to look at, they're also available in Dorico Elements. Of course, you have a player limit, which is now 24 players. So if you importing very large MIDI files, of course, that would be an issue, but all of the options will still exist for anything up to 24 players in Dorico Elements. So I'll get out of the way down here in the corner and make sure I can see the chat down here. So let me know if there's anything questions-wise that you want me to answer, and I'll keep an eye on that. I'll probably come back to the questions at the end. I'm on my own today, so yeah, let me know if there's anything in there. And let's get started. Presumably you can all hear me okay and everything else. People are saying hello, so that's good. So I'll carry on and presume that's okay. So what we're going to look at today is an example actually to start off with by a guy called Lorne Balfe. If you're not aware of Lorne Balfe, you can visit his website if you like and have a look at some things there. But he's worked on all sorts of things. So in his film section, there's a lot of films. There's some Mission Impossible. There's Black Widow, Lego Batman. In the video games section, he's worked on Call of Duty and he's worked on Assassin's Creed and various other things. And in the television section, there's a long list of things that you may have watched some of. And in particular, he also has put some of these things on Twitter. So you can download, and I got a Cubase file and a MIDI file for his Dark Materials, and that's what we're going to start looking at today. And that was just available on his Twitter account. So the Cubase project, I'm not going to load Cubase right now, but basically, you know what a Cubase project looks like. And if you don't, well, it looks like this kind of thing. You've got a lot of tracks. They're grouped very sensibly in a string section and a brass section, but there's a lot of different techniques and things going on, even for each individual instrument. And you can see, this is a brass section and a woodwind section down here. There's a fair amount going on. There's a fair amount of tracks, and if you export that from Cubase and import a MIDI file, if you've done this into Dorico 3.5, then it does a good job. But let's have a quick look at what some of the things were. So let's see These would have been the track names. So, for example, this is the strings section. So there's, this you would probably guess it's a Spitfire symphonic string violin 1 something legato, played legato maybe. And if this was your Cubase project, you probably know what the track names are. If this isn't, then you might not know what they are. We might need to try and work out what some of these are. And that's what one of the things Dorico will be able to help you with for future projects as well. The idea here is that these are not going to be terribly useful, and having to sort out this kind of thing is one of the first annoyances. Here's another bit. This is the brass section. I'm guessing again it's a Spitfire symphonic brass tuba. I'm guessing with a long D. Brackets D from Cubase can often mean it was a duplicated track. Whether that means you want it or not, it may be up to the composer or you to try and work out. Here's a file that was a full import of everything and kind of having a quick look at it in Dorico 3.5. So, for example, here there's some very low red notes here, and that's because it was the Symphonic Strings CB leg, which I'm guessing was probably the contrabass played legato, but we've Dorico 3.5 had put it on a treble clef because it didn't really know what it was, and so that's the kind of thing you needed to then sort out in Dorico. Similarly down here, there's an ensemble spizzicato which has ended up with a out of range for effectively whatever instrument that was imported into. You may also find things where these tracks were. Let's have a look. It's a brass. I'm going to guess it was a bass trombone, probably, with these ones. In fact, yes, I do know that one was a bass trombone. I've had a look at that one. These were probably French horns, but it's the kind of thing that initially Dorico isn't going to know by default. And also, you may not want big played chords in one staff either. You may obviously need individual instruments. And for individual instruments, things like this, which was this was the OACT felt mixed, which I was confused about initially until I imported it. It was a piano. It was a type of piano, probably the name of the sample that was used in Cubase. So this, of course, because you need multiple voices going on here, and that didn't happen by default in Dorico 3.5 either. These are some of the things that we then looked to try and solve in Dorico 4 to say, how could we make this better? We might not be able to solve all of it at the beginning, but how can we give you something that's a bit easier to work with and more manageable, not quite so overwhelming when you're doing it, and the kind of tasks that you need to repeat when you're doing these kind of things, especially if you're working with your own Cubase template or your own Logic template into Dorico, or working with the same composers and they're using similar templates or different templates, but you get another file from them, then you have to go through the same process of sorting all of those things out. So that's the kind of thing we're going to look at in today's session. It looks like everybody can hear me and everything's that's okay. So let's carry on. As I said, if you want to ask any questions in the live chat, then I'll get to those at the end of the session. So you can, when you're importing MIDI into Dorico, if you want to, you could start with a file you already have. You could start with a template file of ours or a file that you've already got and import the instruments into there if you want to, but you can also just import a load of MIDI files. So here is a MIDI file. I'm just going to open a MIDI file and let's have a look at this one. So this is the new MIDI import dialog, and I'm going to look at all of the options here and kind of try and explain what they all do and why you might want to use some at some times and some at other times. So hopefully you'll then get a full understanding of this. And also, I said, you can import it into an existing template, but also what you can do is import a bit of this MIDI file, work on some of that, and then import a bit more of the MIDI file. So you can kind of import some instruments and then import some more instruments into the same project later, so that you don't have quite as much information to try and have to deal with all at the same time, which is obviously going to be very helpful. So this is, of course, all the MIDI track names that we saw from Cubase, and this is what Dorico 3.5 and before would have imported as the staff name, and that gives all sorts of problems. For example, because in this template the strings are at the top of the template, they are track 1 down to track about 20. Because all the strings are first, then when you import the MIDI file, they would all be at the top of the file in Dorico, where actually you probably wanted the strings at the bottom and you wanted the woodwinds at the top, for example. So because we didn't know what they were, they ended up in the wrong order. So Dorico now will try and work out what the instrument is, but also I'm using this use track memory option, and if I untick this, some of these instruments will change. So for example, it's labeling some of these to work out what things are and everything else, but it might not always know. So for example, this one says, I don't know, it doesn't include the word violin, viol, the VLN or anything else. So Dorico isn't sure what that one is. So it's put it on a grand staff because it's saying, well, it's probably strings of some sort. So, but it's put it on a sketch instrument, which is one of the new instruments, and doing it that way. If we use the track memory, then actually, because I've already imported a template similar to, or imported a Dorico project, imported a Cubase project via the MIDI file with the same track names, Dorico knows that last time I imported this, I assigned this to a cello, so maybe I want to do that again. So the use track memory is remembering what did I assign this MIDI track name to, which instrument did I assign it to last time, and it's using that the next time. So the idea here is that if you're importing one project and working on all of that and sorting out what the instruments are, great, project finished. the next one, the next scene, the next film you're working on, the next game, whatever, when you're importing another MIDI file from that same template, Dorico now is going to give you a much better idea. It's much quicker at working out what are the instruments that you assigned last time. It's probably going to be very similar that you want this time. So the use track memory is doing that for you. In the previous session, 2 weeks ago, what we looked at was the interpreter's general MIDI. If you've got a MIDI file from the internet, it might not have useful track names again, but it might have general MIDI program changes in it. If it's, MIDI's been around since 1983 or something, if it's a MIDI file that's available on the internet that's just designed to play in any player, then it may well have general MIDI program changes. So if you tick that button, Dorico could also work out what the instruments were from that. But from Cubase projects and from Logic and various other things these days, you probably want to use the track memory and we can sort out what these instruments are. I'm going to use the advanced editor so that we can actually decide what's going on and kind of more fine-tune what's going on in this one. And there's a quick question which I will answer now. What's Dorico's new sketch instrument? The sketch instrument is actually, it's just a family of things like a treble staff, a bass staff, a string staff, which is just a grand staff just for strings. There's one for brass, there's one for woodwind. So when you're just starting out and kind of sketching something out and you're saying, I think I want brass here, you don't have to add, all of the right brass instruments at that point. You can just say, I'll just have a brass sketch staff, which is just a grand staff with that you can start with the right sounds on, that kind of thing, that you could maybe explode out to the other instruments later. So what we're going to look at now is a few of these instruments. So we have a big old long list here. We've got 56 tracks. It's actually remembered that the last time I did this, I didn't import the percussion, and that's because I know from the session. I wasn't at the session. I've seen a PDF of the score that in this particular one they didn't notate all of the percussion. So I didn't need any of that. So I've just unticked it. So the first advantage is, in previous versions of Dorico, you open a MIDI file, you get all of the tracks, and it might be far too many. So the first thing here is you can untick the ones that you don't want to import, so that you don't have all that extra stuff that you then have to delete at the other end. What's the point in Dorico working out what it is, notating it, if you're just going to delete it again? You don't need to bother doing that. So some of these are just unticked. So there's some enable selected, disable selected, invert selection, and select all. So you can, for example, select everything and disable them all, and then just pick a few things that you want to do. So I'll select all of the instruments here, disable selected, so now I'm not importing anything. And now let's look at some things in individual sections instead. So I'm going to use the filter up here to find wherever flutes exist in here. So flutes seem to be track 33 and 37. So it's working out here, and it's using some of the previous knowledge that we've already done. This is a flutes A2, and so it's going to import this one. And if I tick the box, in fact we'll tick the other one as well, then what Dorico is going to do is say, well, actually, this is now going to be 2 flutes, because I've previously decided it was 2 flutes because it was a flutes A2 staff. Also, the maximum number of simultaneous notes may give you a clue in some cases that it may be, you need extra instruments. So I've added 2 flutes here. And for this one here, in fact, you can also see this one says long. So down here, there's no articulations. When I choose this one here, it's a short staccato one, so we're applying the staccato articulations. But what Dorico is doing by default is, so that we don't accidentally overwrite something or kind of bunch too many things up into instruments, it's by default giving you 2 extra flute players. So now I've got 4, and that might be what you want to start off with. That might be what you want. Having already looked at this file and and what's in it, I know that actually we should be safe to say that this flute 3 is actually the same as flute 1. So this flute is flute 1 and this one is flute 2. So now this track is going to be exploded out into 2 flutes, and this track is going to be exploded out into the same 2 flutes, so that we're not adding extra staves that we don't need, because I know those will be okay. And this one, when it imports it, will also add the staccato dot, so that we've also added the notation at that point. There's also other articulations that you can add to this. So if you wanted a different articulation or anything else, or if there was a particular track that was definitely had tremolos, because that's the sound that was being used at the other end, or trills or anything else, then they can also be added as well. And this is where in the last session we added the voice separation mode for the piano part, which obviously I don't need for these flutes. So that's the first bit. I've just selected a couple of flutes and imported those. So actually, let's just import those. So you can tell, even if I delete my filter here, because nothing else is ticked, and if I want to do this is show all tracks. If I do show only the enabled tracks, then you can see the only things I'm about to import are these flutes. That's it. There are also these import options at the bottom. So this can do a bunch of other things for us. And it's important to know probably which ones you're going to use. So you can, if you want to, when we're using it again, overwrite the track contents when importing into an existing flow or player. We'll use that and come back to that, but probably in a bit. The notations options we looked at in the previous session. So if there are overlapping notes, Dorico will detect slurs. If there are tremolos or trills, because of the way they're played, then Dorico can also detect those potentially for you as well as playing techniques. There are split notes here if you want them for piano. And there's also, you can filter out key switches. So if there are key switches in the file that you're not going to want because you're going to be using Dorico to trigger the correct staccato by putting a dot on it, and then using our expression maps to do that, you don't need the key switch, so you can filter out all of those at the beginning. That will also help because you then don't get Dorico going, oh, there's a really low note there, so maybe this is a grand staff instrument, or maybe there's an extra voice needed, or that kind of thing. You can just filter them out if you don't need any of those. You can leave them in if you want, but delete them later, but filter them if you wish. And also your quantization options are here. So if you want to set some quantization options at the beginning, you can do that as before. There's also this option for creating player groups and part layouts. I'm going to leave the part layouts option off. So what Dorico is going to do is import this track. I'm going to get a score, but I'm not going to get any of the parts. And that's because at the moment, I'm still working out exactly which instruments I need and everything else. There's no point in Dorico creating parts at the moment because they're probably not going to be necessarily even the instruments I want, never mind exactly what's in the part. So for now, I'll leave that off. We'll do the parts later. And I can also later going to use the group option, so we'll come back to some of those later. So to start off with, all I'm going to do is import flutes, and that's it, just to start off with. So I haven't started with a template. I've not started with anything else. Excuse me. Here we have just the flutes, but as you know from what we've just set, we had the two tracks. At various times, they've been split because they were playing chords. So here they're playing different notes. And at other times, here, there was actually only one bit in the MIDI file. But because I've split it onto two flutes, it's doubled for both flutes. If you don't want that, of course, it's very easy to delete it now. But when it got to this part here, there were some chords, effectively. So they've been split out onto two players. So just for that, quick, simple example, you can see I've got a lot less to deal with. I've got some staccato dots by default. It split things out. I've got two flutes, and if I wanted to, you can turn on condensing, and it will put them, onto one staff and all that kind of thing. Because in setup mode, we've just got two flutes. So now I want some other instruments. So now, when you go to the File menu and go to Import and Import MIDI, I'm just going to choose exactly the same MIDI file again. So this is the same MIDI file. Doesn't have to be. It could be a new version that somebody sent you of the same track with a different thing in it. It doesn't have to be the same file, but in this case it is. So this is showing me all the same data. Now at the top up here, we've got a couple of extra options. One is this destination. So I'm going to choose the destination as the same flow that I already had. So I'm going to import things into the same flow. The default actually is to choose new flow so that you don't accidentally overwrite something. And that also, of course, if you're using destination as the same flow as before, then that's where this overwrite all track contents may also be important. So be aware of that option. If you're not sure what one of these tracks is, so next what we're going to do is I'm going to say disable everything. And I'm going to have a look at, let's look at some trombones in this one. So I'm going to filter for some trombones here. So what we're going to do with these is import the trombones. And you could say, well, I'm not sure, we had a look at this label before. If you weren't sure what that is and you want to import it into the project, but you don't necessarily want to import it into the same flow, that's where you could say, well, import it into a new flow. Let's have a look at it and then decide, do we want to copy and paste it, or do we want to delete that, and actually understand what's going on. And that will really depend on whether it's your Cubase file or the composer very well and know the kind of information that's going to be in that, and what the track name is, or do you not know what it is and you need to import the file, import the data and have a look at it first. So anyway, so for this I'm going to import into the same flow. I'm going to choose this one, which I think is going to be bass trombones, probably some kind of A2 patch, although it says here there's 3 simultaneous notes at times. So I've said that for this one, when I select this track here, and I've got a tick in the box here, I'm going to say it's going to be for 3 instruments. What Dorico did by default, just to show you, so I delete these 2, it just gave me 1 trombone and said, we're just going to use 1. I said, okay. So there are buttons here to change the instrument that it's picked if you don't like it. You can duplicate the instrument, which I'm going to do a couple of times to get extra trombones, or you can add extra players in here. So in this case, I'm just going to use 3 trombones. So the first one here I'm going to choose is going to be trombone 1, the second one is going to be trombone 2, and the third one is going to be trombone 3. For this one here, if I tick this track, let's import this one as well. This one has up to 4 simultaneous notes. So I've created a trombone, I've duplicated it, and I've also added a bass trombone, because I think the notes are going to be that low in this particular track that probably, and the instrumentation that we're going to be using was probably 3 trombones and at least 1 bass trombone. For this one here, if I put a tick in this box, this one says it was a bass trombone A2 short staccato, so it's going to get staccato dots. It says there are only 14 notes, and you may know from the track, you might not, whether those can be, this bass trombone could actually be the same as bass trombone 1, or actually does it need to be a second bass trombone because it's playing at the same time as the others? And you can solve some of these things later in Dorico, so it's not, it's not the end of the world. Moving things up and down between staves is very easy. So now what I'm going to do is, just for these trombones, import them into the same flow that the flutes already exist in. I'm going to leave all of the other import options, press OK. So now Dorico is importing the trombones that I asked for, and you can decide then, how many you want and anything else. And I decided in this case that these here, because there's an overlap, actually I might not initially want them all to be put together. It was easier to sort the information out here. So at the moment I've got 6, but that's okay because I can use the other tools in Dorico to move things around if I need to now. So let's say, for example, these 3 trombones here, which are 4, 5, and 6, if I need to move them, I can use, move to staff above. For those sections, I'm using a shortcut that I've set for move to staff above. Also exists as a paste special command, so you've got move to staff above and below, and there's the shortcut. So you can very easily sort some of these things out, and that's where you can see, for example, these ones here and these here are doubling. So maybe actually these notes weren't needed. You want these notes instead up here. Those are the kind of decisions that you may want to work out later. But it's much easier to do that when you have less instruments to work on and you can actually see a bit more what's going on in this file. It'll tell, of course, Dorico will also give you a warning about ranges and various other things. And there's various other tools that you might want to use at any point as you're working on the file. So, for example, here we have some notes that maybe these 3 bars, they need to be requantized or in some other way make these notes longer. So for this one, let's try requantize. So let's go to Edit, Requantize. So for the selected notes, I can requantize this as a different note value, like that. You could also select a note and you could use the option in the right menu for edit duration and extend to next note. So you could, if you've got lots of note rest, note rest, note rest, note rest, and especially if they're all different note values, but you just want them all to be extended to the next note so it removes a lot of the rests. And it may be because you then want to put staccato dots on or anything else. Extend to next note is a very good option. And that also, in fact, did we put it in the, I might have done it in the live stream where I said if you use J for the jump bar, then you can use things like extend to next note. And you can add jump bar commands and those kind of things in here. So it may be that you want to, as part of the workflow you're using, use the jump bar and various commands in there. You can also, of course, use the key editor at the bottom. So for making some edits, then what you might want to do is, select a note and have a look at how long it is in the key editor down here. And you could decide that actually what you do want that note to be longer or not. You can see the overlaps in here, and you can tweak the length of the note in here and drag this accordingly if that's the way you want to work it that way. The important thing is that when you're working on this, I'm only working on a few of the instruments and I'm going to need some of the others, but that doesn't matter because I can now save this one, save this file as I'm working, and then let's say I've then removed some of the extra trombones. So, for example, these notes are probably going to be the first 3 trombones. Maybe we've decided what we're doing here and doing something like this, and eventually you'll get to a point where there's no music on those other 4 trombones, so you can then delete those staves because you don't need them. But again, we're still working on a lesser number of staves, so I can delete this. This doesn't actually make any difference. I can just delete the player because there aren't any part layouts, because we're not doing that extra work of creating part layouts at the moment. So let's just delete a couple of these other ones. There's one, and this one. Don't need that one either. So now I've just worked on a few of those. Did I need the second bass trombone? I can't remember now. Maybe, yes, I probably did. In fact, these, maybe we still need to use a filter or anything else to sort out these notes. This is maybe a good case for things like extend to next note, because I can select all of these notes here, and then you can say right, edit duration, extend to next note. And it will sort out all of those for me. And maybe I want to use a filter or something else to then add some notes to the other bass trombone. Maybe I don't need both. Those are the kind of decisions you need to make. Now I want to move on to some other instruments, so I can just keep doing the same process. I can go File, Import MIDI. Maybe the strings weren't finished originally. Maybe they were in the original file. Doesn't matter. I'll choose the same file for now. And now let's have a look at some strings. So let's deselect the things we did have selected in this file and look at some string tracks. Now in here there are at least 20 string tracks, which we're not going to want all of them, and maybe this is a case where you're not sure what all of these are and you want to import some and actually have a look at some of these to understand what's going on. And that's where maybe importing temporarily into a new flow in this project is going to be a good idea, because you can kind of import things and have a look at it there, but you may still just want to import into the same flow. And if you import into the same flow, have a quick look at it and say, actually, that isn't quite what I wanted, then of course just press undo or delete those instruments and then re-import it again. There's no problem there. And of course you also have the option to overwrite the track contents. So if you've imported something and it's not quite right, you can come back here, import it again, and overwrite the track that you'd imported, if that makes your workflow any better. Sometimes you may also want to import these MIDI track names, and so that you can make a note of which one's which, you can use the MIDI track names. So there's a tick option over here for use MIDI track names, which would then say, for the instrument I'm going to add here, instead of making it a cello, it would leave it as the track name. And maybe that's a useful labeling option for you to use. But you would also know which instrument it had imported into, and I'll show you what I mean by that, so that that may also give you a clue as well. So I'm going to import, what was I going to import into this one? Ah, yes. So we've got 20 string tracks here, but actually the first one I want for the string section is actually an ensemble string one, which was, shout if you see it, this one. So it's a symphonic strings ensemble long. And as I said, because I've looked at this before, and because use track memory is on, then it's given me some other instruments. By default, this string track here, with use track memory off, was going to go to a grand staff of a sketch instrument. So it didn't really know what that instrument was, but it knew it had 4 notes at times. So it was going to put it on a grand staff for us, and we'd have to work it out. Because I've imported it once, had a look at it, I know what it is, and I can read the label and understand, and I've seen the Cubase project, so I know it's a symphonic strings ensemble long patch. I know actually I probably want it to be 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. So it's going to split that out on the way in. So I'll tick the box to say, I'd like to import this track, please. It's going to assign these to instruments. So here we've got some stringed instruments now added to this project. You'll also see these strings have 2 heads. If I double click on it, then I'll get 1 head. And what it's doing is, you can see it's swapping the player type over here between single and section. The difference, of course, is that a single player in Dorico can also double on another instrument. So, for example, flute and piccolo. And a section player is going to be like a desk of violins, where you've got multiple people playing the same part, and they might do divisi, but they're not all going to suddenly put those down and play piccolos. They're not going to, switch instruments. It also gives you a different sound. So for most sample libraries, by default, you'll get, for example, a solo violin versus a section violin. So the number of heads at the beginning here, when you're importing the players, will make a difference. All the things I've done so far were importing the single players, and these ones are going to be section players. The next one I want to import, I had to make a note because I forgot what the track, oh yes, this one, it is the next one, is this one, which is a long D. And now sometimes D means duplicate, it means you don't want it. But in this case, the total number of MIDI notes is only 18, not 111. So it's not an exact copy of the previous one. It also only has 2 simultaneous notes at times, not 4. So it's probably not an exact copy of that one. And from a previous import, I know that's true. And actually, we want to split it out into 2 or 3 instruments. So we're going to split it to a cello and 2 contrabass. The question is, do you want this to be the same cello or a different cello? So at the moment, I'll leave it as a different cello, but you could say this cello is the same cello 1 if that's all you need. Yeah, and that's your choice that you can make as you're importing it. And because these are all the long patches, I'm not going to need any of the articulations with any of these at the moment. That's all okay. I'm also going to import this one, which is a symphonic string cello A P-leg D, which is a played legato duplicate one. And again, the choice is that the same cello? I think it is. So if you want it to be, you can choose the cello and you can say actually import it into the same one as one of these others, so we're not getting extra cellos again. And there's also one here which is a contrabass one. So I'll import that, and you can choose which contrabass you want it to be on. So again, I'm going to import this into the same the same flow that I was using before. So now Dorico is adding to the one we had before. It's adding all of these other bits. Now there may be bits that you still want to tweak. For example, this contrabass down here for some reason was only playing 1 note there, which may just need to be in a different staff. Maybe there was a sample reason why it was separate initially. You may also want to work on these kind of things in galley view, because then you're not scrolling up and down so much. So it's much easier probably to scroll left and right and see what's going on. Some of these notes, maybe these are a bit low. Maybe actually some of these needed to be the cello. But again, moving between staves is very easy. So making a selection, maybe those notes are, but this one needs to be lower, or whatever. Moving notes between staves, of course, very easy. So we've imported these strings, but I also know from this project that there's a load of other string staves that we also need to be able to deal with. So again, I can now look at some of those. Once I'm happy with this, let's say I am, we'll move on, import MIDI again. So the point is, this MIDI dialog, don't just think about using it once. You can very easily use it multiple times to import all of the things that you want in a manageable, way, so you know what you're doing. So let's have a look at some more strings from this one. We're going to import into the same flow again, and we're going to pick some different string staves. And this is because I know that in this particular one, there were so many strings that in the end, they had a string section A, a string section B, and an overdub string section for all sorts of things. So sorting those from of the 20 tracks into the right bits was the important thing to do here. So this one, for example, I needed to find I think more like these ones, these initial ones, which does say violin. So it's giving it a good guess. So let's say we want the violin 1 played legato, and we want the violin 2 played legato, but actually maybe they are the same. Not sure, probably not. So we'll leave them. And then this one is a played legato as well. And maybe this one was, let's say this one is the same as these two. Now they're labelled as violin 3 and 4 because I've already got 2 violins. And I'm making a new violin section here, and so that I know which ones they are and they're definitely in their own section, I'm going to make a player group for the new players. So on this import, I'm adding an extra option just to make a player group for any of the new players that I'm adding to this project. So let's say we also want the viola played legato and I think the cello one, but the violin legato 1 amped I don't need because I know that's a duplicate of something else with a different sound on it, and the same with the cello one here, so I don't need either of those either. So you can choose the options you want in here. Let me just check, I got a cello, I've got some violins, I've got a viola, so let's go with that one initially. It's enough to work on. So again, only the ticked options are going to be imported. It's going to be imported into the same destination, but this time it's going to use the player group. So press OK. Here we go. So now we've got them here. So I've got my initial strings that I imported here, and I probably, would have continued tidying those up to make sure I didn't have 3 contrabasses if I didn't really need them, etc., etc. But very clearly, the ones I've just imported are in this section, which has been labelled MIDI import. And I can change that because what it's done is in setup mode, added a new player group here, and I know this one is in the end going to be the overdubs strings. Maybe I want those above the other strings. I can drag them around, of course, or anything else. So now I've got just those strings imported. And I can now, it's grouping things much more easily. So over some of the other things, the other ways you would have imported, it's a much easier way to see them. Now, you might prefer to import everything all at the beginning and say, you know what, I just give me everything and then I'll, sort it out. But the fact that Dorico can help you with at the beginning with the track names means that you can assign those in that interface first to say, I've got all the right track names. The orchestral order is going to be much easier. It also means if you use things like the filters here, so I'm going to click on this little filter button up here, because I'm in Galley View, and I'm just going to add the default filters for the various families, then it means that these kind of things are going to be sorted out by default because I'm importing the instruments, and from the beginning, it's the right instrument, it's in the right family, it's in the right place in the score. It's just going to be easier to sort out. And it may be that actually, with these filters, you do or don't want all of the strings to be in a particular family. So you can edit the filters if you want to. You could make a filter for each string section. It doesn't matter. And then you now have them available. You can turn the filters on here and you can decide to look at, for example, just the brass or just the violins. So if you had imported absolutely everything from the beginning, you could still limit what you're seeing, the kind of visual, so much to deal with is much reduced because you can just focus on those instruments that you want to be dealing with right now. A few other things that, as part of the workflow, that may also be very useful. One is, of course, this power button. So up on the toolbar here, the power button is active. It may well be that when you're doing this and just sorting out, instruments and, so which music is on which staves and all that kind of thing, you can turn the power button off and Dorico won't bother loading any of the samples that you're using for this project. If you like this by default, then in the Dorico preferences, which is in edit preferences on the Mac, in the play section, there's an option here to activate the project only at various times. So activate the project when only one project, so if you have one project that you open in Dorico, mine would always be active. So this project is active. But I could say, ask me. So when I first start any project, ask me if I want it to be active. Or you could say, never. You could be somebody who says, you know what, I don't worry about playback until maybe right at the end. So generally, never activate playback. There's also this option for activate subsequent project. So if you opening the project twice, let's say maybe you've imported the MIDI file with all of the track names that they had by default because you had no idea what was in them, and then you're importing the MIDI project in a separate project. It could be a separate flow, but it's a separate project with all of the Dorico, working out what the track names are as you go. And if you're copying and pasting or clicking on 2 different projects, you don't want Dorico to be loading and unloading samples as you're moving between them or copying and pasting between them. So this is where you can, by default, choose what the state of the project activation, whether the samples are loaded. So that can be quite useful just as a speed thing on your computer because it's not doing, loading samples when you don't want it to be. It's similar to not bothering to create any of the parts yet until you really need them because you just don't need them yet. And also, one thing I would say is if you are activating the project, you are using samples, and you're then, during the process going, oh, that's not quite right, I want to change the sample and that kind of thing, and then you're importing more instruments into the project, what you will find is that because as soon as you start editing, so what I mean by this is as soon as you start going into the Hallion player, which is opened on the wrong monitor, and you're using any of these options, if you make any tweaks to things, you may find that you don't get some of the other instruments loaded because Dorico then goes, you're in a kind of, it's trying to be a bit hands-off and not destroy anything you might have done. You might have used some of those other channels. So what I personally would recommend is consider whether you want the playback to be on or not at all while you're doing all this import type thing. And don't manually choose some of those things. If you're not getting, all of the right sounds or anything else, choose the right instruments, put the notes in, on the right staves, and then just go playback template and reload the playback template. And that will then reload everything, with all of the samples and only the samples that you need. So you don't have extra samples of things that you've deleted, like when, you know, these 6 trombones, and if I delete them, I don't need them. You won't end up with things, you know, any of that extra stuff, any of the extra overload on your computer that you don't really need. You can just apply the playback template. Dorico will only load the samples that you need, and that will apply for any sample library that you have a playback template for. We've looked at a couple of the other things. So, you know, for MIDI editing, there's a lot of tools you can use, whether it's, you know, selecting a note, like I said, and just using the key editor, because this is, you know, the easiest way to edit what's going on in this bar here. Whether it's, you know, the extend to next note, whether it's, you know, any of the other options that are useful in there. There's also, in fact, let me just import one more and have a look at the piano that was in this one. So originally from, I think it's at OC. Hang on, let me just check. It was a piano, please. So yes, there were 2 piano staves, this one and this one. So when you're importing this one, you know, it's taking a guess, and I've had to tell it what this one is. The use track memory now knows that this is a piano. So if I use the same thing again, you get the idea. It's using the 4-voice keyboard separation option here, and I can import this into the same flow, okay? All of the same options. I don't need it to be in a group this time, so I'll untick that and press OK. So I can now import the pianos into this project. Now, the difference versus earlier versions of Dorico is that it's now going to have a look at working out. Here we go. It's now going to have a look at working out the voices. Not exactly what I wanted, but easier to deal with, which is the important thing here. Well, so in piano 1 here, I think it's used the split point, and I probably shouldn't have done. So I'm going to use select more. I've selected one note here. I'm in galley view, so systems don't make a difference. So I'm just going to press select more to select all of the other notes in this part, and I'm going to move those to the lower staff as well, because actually they were just played in octaves. I've got a bit of an overlap here, but that's only because I'm in galley view, so I'm not too worried about that. Now, a couple of the other editing things to sort out things here is, for example, if I choose a note, as before, you know, if I choose a note and make it smaller, then that's all fine. But I've got some notes in another voice here because Dorico's created 2 voices for me automatically. So now I've got some space. I'm just going to click on these notes and press the letter V, which is going to switch them into the upper voice. So if I do that, for example, here as well, it's basically the same edit, isn't it, actually? This is just repeated, but never mind. Press V, so it switched it. So now these 2 notes, for example, can be, depending on what you call them, minims, half notes. And you can also use select more for things like I have a slur here. So if I select one and then press select more once, it will select all the other slurs in the bar, and I can delete them because actually they don't make sense anymore with the note durations I've got. You can also, of course, you know, if you preferred these notes to be in the lower staff, then you could move them to the lower staff if you wanted, or not. But now I have, you know, a bar which will make a bit more sense. In fact, I should have assigned playback to it, but never mind. This bar I know is exactly the same, so of course you can use R to repeat things. This bar is a bit different, so maybe I'd need to also, you know, have a look at what's going on in that bar. So those kind of, you know, there are those kind of tweaks with things like select more and voice swapping, just using V between things, which is also making it much easier to, you know, create a much more useful part. But the fact that Dorico's done the creating voices on the way in means it takes a very good go at it. But if there are things that you say, you know what, there's no way you could have actually worked out in, you know, you could very easily edit it as well yourself. And when you finished all of this, of course, what you're going to probably need to do is make some parts. Oh yes, I added the trombones back. Doesn't matter. Let's add some parts. So in setup mode here, I can go to setup and I can go create default part layouts. So let's say I've now basically finished. Create default part layouts. On the right hand side here, Dorico will then go and make me a part for each one of those instruments that we've got. So here you go. Now we've got all the parts. So I don't have extra parts for, you know, if I've been, you know, importing 56 tracks and then whittling them down and having to delete parts and everything else. It's just created them at the point I wanted them, and now I can use those if that would be a useful thing to do. So I mentioned a couple of things about samples. You know, you don't want too many to be loaded if they're not being used, so reloading the playback template is going to be useful for that. And just be aware of that if you're making manual changes. You know, if you say, oh, actually, I'd like to use a different sample for that. I personally would do that more after you've finished importing all the instruments, or at least be aware of that, because you probably want to reload the playback template later as well. And lots of the other editing things that we've looked at, I think will make things much easier. So for this kind of project, we saw from the initial, when I imported it, a mess. Mainly, a lot of the things were because it wasn't picking the right instruments to deal with at the beginning. So it means that this kind of thing is now much easier to sort out and tidy up. So in the end, I've kind of been through this process a bit, and I did do it in chunks. So here is a version of the file that I then kind of, I'd been through it a few times just to have a look at what all of these things should be. So the piano part, in the end, I decided I'd put the slurs back on, but longer, and put those notes in the lower part. Also condensing is now turned on, which is obviously just go to edit condensing, and because even the tracks, this flute track that started out A2, Dorico's put it onto 2 flute staves, and then condensing is showing it again as one staff, which is very useful. But you now have, of course, 2 separate flute parts, which is, of course, much more useful for the session. So what's doing all the condensing for various things, there are still probably some edits that I could do to make this one look even nicer. But you can see it's much more manageable, and you can also see down here I've got my 3 string sections. So I've got the overdubs one, which is actually above, and I've got violin section A, and I've got violin section B. And when they recorded this, they recorded those sections individually, I believe. So like I said, it's just an easier job to tidy up. But then for the next project, so from the same composer, Lorne Balfe, he also put an Assassin's Creed MIDI file on Twitter. So I downloaded that one, and funnily enough, the MIDI track names are very similar to what he had before. So because the use track memory is on with a different MIDI file, you can now have a look at this one, and there'll be very few tweaks that you'd need to make. So for example, it's already not going to bother importing the percussion. I can add them if I want to, but I didn't last time, so Dorico's turned them off. For things like the bass trombones that we did previously, I assigned it to 3 trombones. A quick check in the file here says actually there's only used one note, one simultaneous note. So maybe these trombones aren't needed, so I'll just use 1 trombone. For this one here, there's only 3 needed, not 4. So let's delete one of them. I don't know, let's delete one of the trombones and not the bass trombone. So you can decide what you want to do. Now, maybe I don't know this file as much, so maybe I do want to, add them all onto individual trombones. So if I'm having a look here at trombones, this one's going to go to the first trombone, and this one is going to go to some of the others. So let's say that one is actually trombone 2, maybe that one's trombone 3, etc., etc. So there are still, a few things you might want to tweak depending on what's going on. But Dorico knows, for example, what these tracks are. It had no idea initially what this was. Symphonic string ensemble spiccato D, probably a cello in this case. So you might want to tweak things, you might not, but it's much, much quicker now to just say, yeah, I'll import all of that and open the MIDI file with the track names sorted, because it's the same track names I used before. Okay, there was obviously a track or a title that was a bit odd in this one. So this one was Assassin's Creed. So let's just sort that out we'll do it for the flow as well, shall we? There we go. But for notation wise, piano part, harp part, string section, in the right orchestral order, even though the strings were originally at the top. I've got a lot of strings to, that we can look at, but that's okay. And it's imported them all to the right instruments. So if nothing else, even if I don't do anything else, I've at least got a more manageable file to look at with things importing onto the right kind of staves. Similar here, looks like he's doing a similar thing on the piano, where I'm going to take a guess that these are probably duplicates. Maybe I won't. No, in actual fact, on that one it wasn't. So I went press the shortcut to quit it instead. Yeah, my fault. So let's have a quick look at this one and reopen that. I'm too quick with my shortcuts, aren't I? I'll also have a quick look in the chat as well. So if there's any questions I've missed, because I realised I've been rattling on now for quite a while, and yeah, sorry, you've maybe not had your questions answered. So let's have a look at that as well. So let me just put that file back. Yes, I quit Dorico. That was a bit daft, wasn't I? bit too quick on the old shortcuts. Right, so here we have the same file, obviously, with the file name edited. So yeah, so the idea was it's much easier, much quicker now to kind of sort out and work out what's going on here, because you've got if nothing else, the right track names. And the track history has meant that a different project with the same track names is now much quicker to sort out and work out what's going on. So right, I've just seen the last comment was, what's the composer's name again? This one was Lorne Balfe. He's Scottish. So here you go. Here's while I'm looking at the questions, here's the biography bit from his website. But yes, lornebalfe.com if you want to have a look at that. All right, I'm just going to have a look now at what the comments were. Just bear with me a second and see what I've missed. Oh, you have been busy in here. Okay, right. So questions. If you have expression maps in your MIDI tracks, will they be detected? I've got a feeling Paul answered that one as well. Expression maps instead of key switches. They won't be at the moment, because we use similar expression maps, but ours are slightly different. So I don't think there's necessarily a mapping, but depends, I suppose, yeah, what the techniques are. They may be mapped anyway, but maybe there's something else we can do on that one to improve some of those. I think Paul's actually online, and I think he might have answered that one anyway. Are the Vienna Symphonic Libraries going to be made available to Elements? You can use them, no problem. They're just playback templates. So if you go to dorico.com/resources, you'll find a link there to the Vienna Symphonic Library synchronized playback templates, which were done by VSL, or you can download them from your MyVSL page. So if you log into your MyVSL account, you can download them from there and install them. And then, yes, you can use them, no problem, in Dorico Elements. That's not a problem at all. Let me just have a look. Did I miss any other? I answered the one about sketch instruments. Sorry, I'm just scanning down these. Can the track memory define some regular expressions? There's nothing you can do that at the moment. Oh, Paul's answered that one as well. Well, thank you, Paul. Yes, it remembers the previous ones you set. I'm just reading down the comments. Bear with me a second. Yes, the articulations aren't necessarily in the MIDI file, so in some cases we're working it out. So, for example, very short notes, likely to get imported as staccato, will give you the option of that. But with some of those others, no, they aren't. But of course, they are quite easy to add in later on in Dorico. So if you wanted to, if you just add a slur over something, it will then switch to the legato patch if that's in your expression map. And you can also do a lot of the things with playing techniques. And there are some things that you would maybe do on lots of individual notes, or shortening lots of individual notes in Cubase, where, for example, adding a staccato dot to lots of notes or adding spiccato as a playing technique could also then switch that more quickly in Dorico anyway. So even if they're not all of them imported, it is quite easy to, I think, put a lot of those examples back. If you do have some other examples of those, though, I'd be very interested to have a look. And maybe that's another session we can look at in the future about, importing different types of projects. As I said, I wanted to look at kind of, real world cases of things. So if you have some others, I'd be very, very interested to know. If you don't have the MIDI address, long day. If you don't have the email address already, it's discoverdorico@steinberg.de. So discoverdorico, all one word, at steinberg.de. Let me have a look. I'm just going down the questions. I think Paul's answered some of these, so that's very good. Yes, of course, you can import XML files. So if you have already, for example, added the staccato dots or the tuplets specifically in the notation bit of the score side of Cubase or Logic, and if you've done some of that work already in the DAW, then export a music XML file, because then those things that you've added, like staccato dots, these graphical elements, tuplet brackets, those kind of things, then import them as a music XML file instead, and then that's what you can import into Dorico, and that may be more useful. Of course, it's a slightly different process to this, and you can, I suppose, import some things as music XML and then use the file MIDI import and import some other tracks into the same flow as MIDI if you really wanted to. let's have a look. Does it work for audio files? No, but you can in some cases use a DAW to convert things to MIDI first if you want to, and then import that into Dorico. But you can't do audio directly into Dorico. Can you import the destination instrument names while retaining the MIDI track names temporarily somewhere in the score? No, I don't believe you can. However, when I've been doing this myself... Oh, it's Anthony. Hello, Anthony. When I've been doing this myself, what I'd looked at was then, when I'd imported that track, it was imported, for example, to, if I wasn't sure, violin 4. So then all I need to do is when I go back to the file import, I can have a look which track was it that got imported onto violin 4. Oh, well, that is the track name. It's in the MIDI import dialog. So if you look again in the MIDI import dialog, you can see what violin 4 was, and you can decide to import it to a different one or give it a different playing technique or anything else. So they're not on the score itself, but if you reuse the MIDI import dialog, then the track name, of course, would be in there as well. And there's a different question then that Jeff's answered. That's good. Sorry, there's a lot of questions. Thank you. But yeah, I'll get through these. So yeah, that's okay, Anthony. Exported as yes, you can export the audio if you need to. So when you've finished, of course, use a different sample library if you want to. When you import MIDI parts in blocks and there are loads of parts, does Dorico remember which ones you've already imported? What you will do... Oh, I think Paul might have answered this one as well. Thank you, Paul. Yes, it doesn't by default. So if you've already imported a track, Dorico doesn't know you've already imported it because there's a possibility you want to import it twice. And you have that option to say, I want to move it for doubling or anything else. So if you actually only had one track in the MIDI file, but you want it to be somewhere else as well, you could do that. But the tick boxes will tell you that. So you're choosing, when you're importing into blocks, which sections you're importing or not, or whether you're ticking all of the players and importing them all. And then you have the options to say, if I already have a violin player, import into the same track, and that option at the bottom to say, when you import it, do you want it to import and overwrite the information or not? And if you don't overwrite the information, then it would add to it. So in some cases, you might have a change to a track, and if they're only playing a change at the end, in which case it doesn't matter. You can add it to the existing track. And in some cases, it's a complete edit, a complete change, and you want to overwrite the music that was already there. So you get that option. I think the other questions have been answered by Paul. So if I've missed anything, then let me know. You can, like I said, you can email me if you want to. The chat is now moving because there's some more questions at the end. So I think, did I miss them? I think we're okay. So if there's any questions I've missed that in this bit, and because it's now we're now approaching the top of the hour, if there's anything that you want answered that we haven't answered so far, then just let me know. Our email address is discoverdorico@steinberg.de. So all one word, discoverdorico@steinberg.de, and we can answer those and maybe look at another section of the workflow improvements that we've put into Dorico 4. So thank you much for joining this one. I will now add the chapter headings to various bits of this video. So if you refer back to this video later, you can click on the various sections and come back to this one. Thank you for joining. Thank you for the questions. And let me know, what would you like to see in the next Discover Dorico session? So at the moment, we're aiming to do one of these at the end of every month. So at the end of February, what would you like to see in the next Discover session? Is there something that's a new feature in Dorico 4 or a workflow thing? Let me know, and let's see what we can do. So thank you very much, and I don't think there's any questions that I've missed so far, so thank you for joining us. I'll see you next time.